Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover three different topics. The first one's going to be the presidential elections in Azerbaijan, which were held yesterday. Then we're going to move on to a series of arrests made by the NSS on corruption charges. And then we're going to close the show with discussing about the constitutional changes that are brought up and are being discussed by this government. We had our own correspondent in Baku covering yesterday's Azerbaijan's presidential elections. Let's go to his report.
On your mark, get set.
I want to thank Sasha Baron Cohen of Borat fame for helping us cover the elections in Baku, because anything this absurd or surreal could only really be covered by a comedian. Now we're going to move on to the corruption arrests that were made last week by the NSS. Just for you to know what that stands for, it's the National Security Service. They had arrested 6 people, a high-up person in the Ministry of Economy, and along with few people in other ranks, including the sister-in-law of the Speaker of the Armenian Parliament, Alan Simonian. This is apparently part of 2 different probes. One of them is in regards to rigging a process of state contracts for one company to get it over others. And the second one is about abuse of agro-business financing programs that the government has. So what are we to make of all this? First and foremost, we know very little about these charges. So we need to essentially assume these people to be innocent until they've had their moment in court. In a way, if this is actually true, this is very good because this government is willing to investigate and arrest people close to its ranks or high positions of power. But to be honest with you, I'm a bit skeptical of all of this, because we've seen arrests like this before, and they make a big show of it, and then you find out months or years later that no one's guilty of anything, and no one's been charged or actually convicted of anything. And we've seen actually many arrests like this. We saw it after the war, and there was actually a report in EurasiaNet this week about how a lot of the arrests that were made that were for treason have all fallen apart because they didn't have the cases to prove it, but when they were making the arrest, they made a big show of it. This could also be part of political infighting within this government, which we know is going on between pro and anti-Western factions. Most importantly, since we have not properly reformed our judiciary, which is the biggest domestic failure of this government, people do not have any trust in our judicial system, so no one knows who's guilty or if this is not a politicized process. I am all for fighting corruption, but in this case, put me in the ranks of the skeptics. Now we're going to move on to the third topic of the week, which is discussions that are going around about changing Armenia's constitution or changing the flag, national anthem, and a half a dozen different things. This messaging has essentially come out of 2 places, which is the Prime Minister's office. He himself has talked about this extensively in interviews and other things. And so has the Speaker of the Parliament, Alan Simonian. What they've discussed, the need for a new constitution, that the constitution is dated, that it doesn't reflect Armenia of the world of today. The Prime Minister even talked about the establishment of a 4th republic. And obviously they've talked about matters like taking Ararat off of the national seal, changing the flag, the national anthem, and having these discussions. Frankly, there are good reasons to have all of these discussions. We can discuss all of these matters between ourselves. There's differing opinions. People can disagree, argue, fight over each of these issues, as long as these issues are not being used to placate foreign or external gangsters, which is actually what is going on in this case. Now let's look at the technical issues around changing Armenia's constitution, because first and foremost, Armenia's constitution can only be changed by a national referendum, not by a vote of the parliament. And these are the rules. Armenia has 2.6 million eligible voters. And according to law, in order for a referendum to be adopted, at least 1/4 of those voters, which is about 650,000 people, need to participate in the elections. Historically, referendums in the past have had miserable turnout in Armenia, and almost all the referendums were held before the revolution, and everyone knows that there were massive fraud that was carried out in order for them to pass the 650,000 number. And now that we have elections that are far more honest, that's going to be a far harder standard to meet. Now, the genesis of all this talk are specific demands that Ilham Aliyev has made in the so-called peace negotiations. And one of them is to take out a reference to Artsakh in the preamble of the Armenian constitution. Now, this is not in the constitution itself, but actually in what is the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence. It's actually the preamble. In reality, this request itself, given the absurdity of it, is sort of prima facie evidence that he's absolutely not interested in signing any peace agreement. Now, why is he demanding this particular change? It's very simple, because this is another opportunity to humiliate this country. Let's just think about the absurdity of it. A dictator in a country whose constitution is essentially what he says he is forcing us, a democratic country, to change our constitution because he's simply demanding us to do so. Secondly, this particular issue gives legitimacy and actually makes him sound reasonable in not signing a peace treaty. And more importantly, it justifies further future aggressions. It will also, if played correctly by him and incorrectly by this government, will be the first step in bringing down this government, which is the number one agenda item of Baku's patrons in Moscow. Now, let me explain how all of this is a giant political trap. I can say that in my 35 years of experience in practical politics, the deadliest traps are the ones that you actually set for yourself, which it seems like the Prime Minister and Speaker are doing for themselves in this case. This referendum will be rejected for a simple reason, that this government does not enjoy that kind of support to pass a referendum like this. And in fact, this referendum will actually become a vote of no confidence in this government, because this government's actual support is somewhere between 25 to, on a good day, 35% of all the voters. So once you give them a chance to say yes or no on a matter, and the person who's pushing it is the current Prime Minister, this measure is going to go down. Furthermore, given the fact that everyone's going to understand that the genesis of all this is not some natural internal issue, but is actually something that's being foisted upon and forced upon us by the dictator in Baku, this will essentially become a referendum and an opportunity to vote against Ilham Aliyev, and that's not an election that no one's going to win in this case. The other point is democratic countries actually have a history of telling their neighbors or the world to go to hell when they have a chance to vote on such matters, and we saw it in a vote in Greece when they had a package with the EU, which the voters came out in full force and voted against whatever the EU was trying to force on the Greek government. And what we have seen, given the turnout and where this government ended up in the Yerevan mayoral elections, they're certainly in no position to actually reverse that. And lastly, and the most dangerous thing is, after this vote goes down and this referendum is rejected, then Baku will get a chance to go around the world and say that Armenian population, the Armenians had a choice to vote between peace and war, and they actually voted for war, which will justify their future aggressions. Perhaps most importantly is that there's no precedence in history for any dictator from Adolf to Ilhan to stop humiliating an opponent who's willing to be humiliated over and over and over again. Every humiliation simply whets their appetite to ask for more. In conclusion, this government needs to be honest with the Armenian people with the following facts that the government itself knows. One, Ilham is never going to sign a peace treaty, since his regime cannot survive without an Armenian enemy. Secondly, that we are in for a period of a long, cold peace with threats of war on us all the time. And if the world situation allows it, Aliyev will move on to aggressions directly against Armenia. Peace will only come not from another round of humiliation, but only from doing the following things. First, by uniting the country and the larger Armenian world in a joint endeavor to defend ourselves at all cost. 2, legally criminalizing the Baku regime for its past and future aggressions via ICC and other legal instruments now, while we have the chance, while going on a full-scale diplomatic offensive to demonize and delegitimize the regime in Baku, something that they've actually been very good at helping us along to do themselves. A good example of that being the elections yesterday. Everything else is tilting at windmills. Thank you for joining me in these sort of insights.
Kazakhstan's prostitutes, cleanest in the region, except of course